Nice costume. Officer Ethan Walker said with a short laugh, sweeping his flashlight across the inside of the black sedan. The beam stopped on a neatly folded judicial robe hanging behind the driver's seat, and his smile widened. You really expect people to believe that? The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the wet highway like ripples of color on dark water. Midnight traffic moved steadily along Interstate 85 just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, tires humming against rain-soaked pavement as drivers slowed to watch the scene unfold. Behind the wheel sat a black man in his late 60s. His silver hair was trimmed neatly. His posture remained straight despite the tension hanging in the air. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel exactly where they could be seen. Judge Nathaniel Brooks had spent more than 40 years inside courtrooms. He had listened to thousands of stories. He had seen anger, fear, regret, and courage cross the faces of people from every walk of life. Yet tonight, standing under the glare of highway lights, he recognized something else in the young officer's eyes. Assumption. Good evening, officer, Nathaniel said evenly. Is there a reason I was stopped? Ethan ignored the question. His flashlight moved slowly across the dashboard, then back toward the robe. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The scent of wet asphalt drifted through the narrow opening in the driver's window. Step out of the vehicle, sir. Nathaniel blinked once. May I ask why? Because I asked you to. The words came sharp and immediate. Several cars passed, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene before disappearing into the darkness ahead. Nathaniel nodded slowly. He had learned long ago that dignity often began with patience. Carefully, he reached for the door handle. Ethan immediately straightened. Slowly, Nathaniel complied. The cool night air greeted him as he stepped onto the shoulder. His black overcoat shifted gently in the wind. In the back seat, next to the robe, rested a leather briefcase containing documents he would need for court the next morning. Ethan studied him from head to toe. Expensive shoes, professional posture, calm voice. None of it seemed to matter. What's with the robe? Ethan asked. Nathaniel glanced toward the vehicle. It's mine. Your costume, you mean? Ethan smirked. No, officer. My judicial robe. For a moment, silence settled between them. Rainwater dripped from a nearby highway sign. The distant growl of a passing semi-truck echoed through the night. Then Ethan laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to make it clear he didn't believe a word. A judge, he said. That's what we're going with. Nathaniel looked at him carefully. That's the truth. Ethan shined the flashlight directly toward the back seat again. Funny thing about the truth, he said. People usually don't have to work this hard to sell it. Nathaniel remained silent. His face revealed nothing. Around them, the highway stretched endlessly into darkness, illuminated only by scattered streetlights and the pulsing glow of the patrol car. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly beyond the clouds. Ethan took one step closer. I think we're going to need a much better explanation than that. Nathaniel Brooks had spent most of his life learning that the loudest assumptions were often made by people who knew the least. The rain continued falling in a fine silver mist across the shoulder of the highway as he stood beside his sedan, hands relaxed at his sides, watching Officer Ethan Walker circle the vehicle with growing suspicion. The patrol car lights painted flashes of blue and red across the polished surface of the black sedan. Every few seconds, those colors reflected in the puddles gathering near the white shoulder line. Ethan stopped beside the rear passenger window and shined his flashlight through the glass again. The robe remained exactly where Nathaniel had left it after the conference, folded neatly, protected by a garment bag. Beside it sat a leather briefcase worn smooth by years of use. To Ethan, it looked like a collection of props. To Nathaniel, it represented 4 decades of work. For decades of early mornings, late nights, difficult decisions, and an unshakable belief that the law could be fair if enough people were willing to protect it. He remembered growing up in a small brick apartment in Detroit. His mother worked double shifts at a nursing home. Some winters, the heat barely functioned. Some months, money disappeared before the month ended. Yet every evening, she placed a stack of library books on the kitchen table and reminded him that education was something nobody could take away. Nathaniel still remembered sitting beneath a flickering lamp reading biographies of Supreme Court justices while snow tapped against the window. Back then, becoming a judge seemed as distant as touching the moon. But his mother had always smiled whenever he talked about law school. She believed in him long before anyone else did. The memory faded as Ethan opened the rear door and examined the contents of the vehicle. "Interesting collection," he muttered. Nathaniel remained calm. "You will find identification inside the briefcase." Ethan glanced toward him but did not move to retrieve it. "Maybe." The response carried the same dismissive confidence Nathaniel had encountered countless times throughout his career. People often saw his skin before they saw his accomplishments. They saw age before wisdom, appearance before truth. Yet he had learned not to carry bitterness. Bitterness clouded judgment, and judgment was something he had spent a lifetime protecting. A pair of headlights approached slowly. A pickup truck passed, the driver briefly turning his head toward the flashing lights before continuing into the darkness. The highway grew quiet again. Ethan stepped away from the sedan and folded his arms. "So let me get this straight. You are telling me that you just happened to be driving around with a judge's robe and legal paperwork in the middle of the night?" Nathaniel nodded once. "I was returning from a judicial ethics conference in Raleigh. And you expect me to believe that?" Nathaniel looked toward the rain-swept road stretching into the distance. His expression never changed. "Whether you believe it does not change whether it is true." For the first time, Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. The answer had not been defensive. It had not been emotional. It had simply been confident. And somehow that seemed to irritate him more. The young officer adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder and stared at Nathaniel for several seconds. Then his gaze shifted toward the leather briefcase again. Whatever doubt might have entered his mind vanished almost immediately. In its place came something colder. A decision. And as the rain continued whispering across the pavement beneath the glow of the highway lights, Nathaniel sensed that the night was about to become much longer. The decision settled across Ethan Walker's face like a door quietly closing. Nathaniel had seen that expression before. Not in courtrooms, not in legal arguments, but in moments when someone stopped searching for the truth and started searching for confirmation of what they already believed. The young officer stepped toward the open rear door of the sedan and pulled the leather briefcase onto the roof of the vehicle. Rainwater glistened beneath the rotating patrol lights. Tiny droplets gathered along the edges of the dark leather. Ethan unfastened the locks and opened the case. Inside were neatly organized documents, conference materials, legal notes, and a stack of folders secured with colored tabs. The smell of paper and leather drifted into the cool night air. Nathaniel watched quietly. He knew exactly what Ethan would find. Certificates from the Judicial Ethics Conference. Court correspondence. Official identification. Years ago, he might have felt anxious in a situation like this. But age had taught him something valuable. The truth remained the truth whether it was recognized immediately or not. Ethan flipped through the contents quickly. Too quickly. The beam from his flashlight jumped from page to page. He was looking at the documents without truly reading them. Finally, he stopped on a photograph attached to an identification card. His eyes narrowed. Nathaniel could see the moment doubt briefly appeared. Then it disappeared again. "These can be made," Ethan said. Nathaniel blinked once. "Federal judicial credentials are not easy to duplicate." Ethan ignored the comment. He continued examining the briefcase. A gust of wind pushed rain across the shoulder of the highway. The garment bag containing the robe shifted slightly through the open rear door. Traffic had become lighter now. The occasional vehicle passed in the distance, headlights cutting through the darkness before vanishing around a curve. Ethan pulled out a thick folder from the bottom compartment. Several papers slid partially free. He caught them and frowned. The cover page displayed official court markings and scheduling information. Nathaniel recognized it immediately. Tomorrow's docket. He had reviewed it twice before leaving Raleigh. "Those are court records," Nathaniel said calmly. "Please be careful with them." Ethan looked up sharply. "You keep giving orders like you think you are somebody important." Nathaniel did not respond. The officer's radio crackled softly on his shoulder. A dispatcher relayed routine information from somewhere beyond the darkness. Ethan pressed a button and responded briefly before clipping it back into place. Then he returned his attention to the folder. His flashlight illuminated lines of printed text. Case numbers, hearing schedules, names, legal references. For several seconds, he stood silently reading. Nathaniel noticed his eyes pause longer than before. The officer shifted his weight. A slight crease formed between his brows. The confidence that had fueled the stop seemed to flicker, if only for a moment. Then he reached the final page. His jaw tightened. Nathaniel could not see the document itself from where he stood, but he remembered exactly what was listed there. The first hearing scheduled for the next morning. A civil rights misconduct proceeding involving allegations against a law enforcement officer. Ethan slowly lowered the folder. Rain tapped against the roof of the sedan. The red and blue lights continued their endless rotation across the wet pavement. For the first time since the stop began, neither man spoke. Then Ethan closed the folder with more force than necessary and looked directly at Nathaniel. Whatever uncertainty had appeared seconds earlier was gone, replaced by something harder, something defensive. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sharp edge that told Nathaniel the situation was moving in the wrong direction. The rain intensified, turning the shoulder of the highway into a ribbon of reflected light. Water streamed down the side of the patrol car and collected in shallow pools along the asphalt. Ethan Walker held the folder under the beam of his flashlight for another moment before sliding it back into the briefcase. His movements had become more rigid, more deliberate. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. The officer was no longer trying to prove he was right. He was trying to avoid the possibility that he was wrong. That difference mattered. "Where did you get these documents?" Ethan asked. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "They were issued through the court." Ethan shook his head. "That is not what I asked." The older man studied him calmly. "Then I am not sure what answer you are looking for." The response seemed to deepen the frustration already building behind Ethan's eyes. The young officer stepped away from the vehicle and paced several feet across the shoulder. His boots splashed through standing water. A cold wind swept across the highway, rattling the nearby guardrail. Nathaniel remained exactly where he stood. Years of courtroom experience had taught him that silence often revealed more than argument. Ethan eventually returned and stopped beside the sedan. "You know what I think?" he said. Nathaniel waited. "I think you are carrying around a lot of very impressive-looking paperwork because you want people to believe a story." The patrol lights flashed across Nathaniel's face. Red, blue, red again. Yet his expression remained unchanged. "The truth does not require belief," he said quietly. "Only patience." Ethan let out a short breath through his nose. "You really like talking in riddles." "No. I simply answer the question that is asked." For several seconds, neither man moved. The sound of passing traffic seemed distant now. Somewhere overhead, thunder rolled beyond the low clouds. Ethan looked toward the robe hanging inside the vehicle, then toward the briefcase, then back toward Nathaniel. Something about the older man's calmness appeared to bother him more than anything else. Most people became nervous during traffic stops. Most people tried harder to defend themselves. Nathaniel did neither. He simply stood there in the rain as though he had complete confidence that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. Ethan reached for his radio again. He spoke quietly into the microphone. Nathaniel could not hear every word, but he recognized requests for information and verification. The officer listened to the response for several moments. His face remained unreadable. Then he ended the transmission. "Interesting," Ethan said. Nathaniel said nothing. "The system is taking longer than expected. Government databases often do." Ethan ignored the comment. Another vehicle passed. This one slowed noticeably as it approached the flashing lights. The driver glanced toward the scene before continuing down the highway. The red taillights gradually disappeared into the darkness. Ethan folded his arms. "Until I can verify everything, I am going to need you to come with me." Nathaniel looked directly at him. "On what basis?" The question lingered in the air between them. Rain tapped against metal. Wind moved through the trees beyond the guardrail. Ethan's jaw tightened. He appeared prepared for resistance, prepared for anger, prepared for an argument. Instead, Nathaniel's voice remained steady, respectful, professional, the same tone he had used for decades inside courtrooms. "Officer," he said, "I would encourage you to think carefully about your next decision." For the first time that night, Ethan seemed to hear not just the words, but the confidence behind them. Yet instead of reconsidering, he straightened his shoulders and took a small step forward. The choice had already been made. And as the storm clouds gathered above Interstate 85, Nathaniel realized that reason was no longer guiding the encounter. Pride was. The drive to the station felt longer than it actually was. Rain streaked across the windows of the patrol vehicle, blurring the glow of streetlights into long ribbons of gold and white. Nathaniel Brooks sat quietly, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on the passing city beyond the glass. He had spent decades listening to testimony from people whose lives could change because of a single decision. Tonight, he found himself thinking about those moments. Not because he feared what was happening, but because he understood how easily certainty could become a substitute for truth. Ethan Walker remained silent behind the wheel. The confidence he had displayed on the highway was still there, but it had become sharper now, almost defensive. Every few minutes he glanced toward the rearview mirror. Each time, he found the same thing waiting for him. Calm. No anger. No pleading. No attempt to argue. The station appeared through the rain shortly after midnight. Its brick exterior glistened beneath floodlights mounted above the parking lot. Water ran down the flagpole near the entrance. Several patrol vehicles sat lined up in neat rows. Ethan parked and stepped out first. The cold air rushed into the vehicle as the door opened. Nathaniel exited carefully and followed him inside. The lobby was quiet. A television mounted in the corner played a late-night news broadcast with the volume turned low. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. A desk sergeant looked up briefly as they entered. His eyes moved from Ethan to Nathaniel and then back again. "What have we got?" he asked. Ethan placed the folder and briefcase on the counter. "Possible false identification issue. Verification is still pending." The sergeant glanced toward Nathaniel. "Sir, can I get your name?" "Nathaniel Brooks." The sergeant typed something into a computer terminal. The glow from the monitor reflected across his face. A few seconds passed, then a few more. His fingers slowed. He frowned slightly and leaned closer to the screen. Ethan noticed immediately. "Problem." The sergeant hesitated. "System is still loading." Ethan nodded, though the answer clearly did not satisfy him. Nearby, another officer walked through the hallway carrying paperwork. A dispatcher spoke quietly over a radio somewhere in the building. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city. Nathaniel stood patiently beside the counter. His coat was still damp from the rain. Tiny droplets shimmered beneath the fluorescent lights. The desk sergeant refreshed the screen again. This time his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing in concentration. He read something carefully. Then he read it again. Ethan noticed. "What is it?" The sergeant looked up. "Nothing. Probably a database delay." Yet his voice carried uncertainty. Ethan folded his arms. "Let me know when verification comes through." The sergeant nodded. Nathaniel remained silent throughout the exchange. He watched the room the same way he often observed a courtroom before a difficult hearing. Every glance, every hesitation, every shift in tone. Years on the bench had taught him that truth often announced itself long before anyone spoke it aloud. Across the lobby, a wall clock ticked steadily toward 1 o'clock in the morning. The station remained quiet. But beneath that quiet, something had begun to change. The first cracks were appearing in the story Ethan had convinced himself was true. He simply had not recognized them yet. The station grew quieter as the night deepened. Most of the phones had stopped ringing. The television in the lobby continued playing to an audience that was no longer watching. Outside, rain drifted across the parking lot beneath pale floodlights, turning the concrete into a sheet of reflected silver. Nathaniel sat alone in a small waiting area near the front desk. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly. Their steady buzz blended with the distant sound of keyboards clicking and occasional radio traffic echoing through the building. Time seemed to slow, yet Nathaniel appeared untouched by it. His coat rested neatly across the back of a chair. His hands were folded calmly in his lap. He had not raised his voice once since the stop began. He had not demanded special treatment. He had not reminded anyone of his title. Instead, he sat quietly, observing the room around him. Years ago, when he was a young attorney fresh out of law school, he believed justice moved quickly. Experience taught him otherwise. Justice often moved slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but its strength came from patience, not speed. A cleaning employee pushed a cart down a nearby hallway. The scent of disinfectant briefly replaced the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Nathaniel watched the worker disappear around a corner and found himself thinking of his mother again. She had spent years working long shifts, caring for people who rarely knew her name. Yet she carried herself with dignity every day, not because others gave it to her, but because she refused to surrender it. The memory brought a faint smile to his face. Across the lobby, Ethan stood near a window overlooking the parking lot. He stared out into the rain with his arms crossed. Every few minutes, he glanced back toward the front desk. The waiting seemed to be affecting him differently. His confidence remained visible, but uncertainty had begun to settle around its edges. The database checks were taking longer than expected. Questions were beginning to appear where certainty had once existed. The desk sergeant refreshed his computer screen again. The glow illuminated his features. He leaned closer. Read something carefully, then leaned back. Nathaniel noticed the subtle shift immediately. A small tightening around the eyes. A pause before moving his hands. Tiny details most people missed. Details that revealed concern. Yet nobody said anything. The wall clock ticked steadily forward. 1 minute. Then another. Rain tapped softly against the station windows. Somewhere in the building, a coffee machine started brewing a fresh pot. The rich aroma drifted into the lobby. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly and listened. The rain. The clock. The distant hum of electricity. There was something strangely peaceful about it. Because despite everything that had happened, he knew who he was. He knew the truth. And when a person knows both, fear loses much of its power. Ethan finally turned away from the window. He looked toward Nathaniel. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Neither man spoke. Yet the silence between them felt different now. Less certain, less controlled, almost fragile. Then a sharp electronic tone broke the stillness. A notification sounded from the desk sergeant's computer. The older officer immediately straightened in his chair. His expression changed. Not gradually. Instantly. He looked at the screen once. Then again. Then he slowly turned his head toward Nathaniel Brooks. And in that single moment, the atmosphere inside the station shifted completely. The notification sound seemed small at first, barely louder than the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Yet every person in the lobby looked toward the desk sergeant at the exact same moment. The older officer stared at the computer screen without blinking. His hand remained frozen above the keyboard. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Rain continued tapping against the station windows. The wall clock ticked quietly in the background. Then the sergeant stood up. Slowly, deliberately. His chair rolled backward across the floor with a soft squeak. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked. The sergeant did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor. "You need to see this." Ethan walked toward the desk. The confidence that had carried him through the entire night returned briefly as he leaned forward to examine the screen. Then it vanished. Nathaniel watched from across the lobby. He did not need to see the information displayed on the monitor. He already knew exactly what it contained. Full judicial verification, federal appointment records, court assignments, professional credentials stretching back decades. Everything Ethan had refused to believe. The younger officer stared at the screen. His jaw tightened. The color slowly drained from his face. "That cannot be right," he said quietly. The sergeant looked at him. "It is right." Ethan leaned closer. Reading, rereading, searching for something that would support the version of reality he had carried all evening. But the screen offered no escape. Only facts. The lobby door suddenly opened. A gust of cool air swept inside along with 2 men wearing dark overcoats. Both moved quickly toward the front desk. One carried a leather portfolio. The other displayed an official identification badge. "Judge Brooks?" the first man asked immediately. Nathaniel rose from his chair. "Good evening, Michael." Relief flashed across the attorney's face. "We have been trying to reach you for over an hour." Ethan turned slowly. The room seemed smaller now. The certainty that had guided every decision he made that night was collapsing piece by piece. The second man approached the desk sergeant and quietly presented credentials from the administrative office of the courts. The atmosphere inside the station shifted again. Officers who had barely paid attention earlier were now watching closely. Conversations stopped. Keyboards fell silent. Even the television in the corner seemed strangely distant. Michael opened his portfolio and removed several documents. "Your Honor, tomorrow's docket has already been updated." Ethan's eyes moved toward the paperwork. One page rested partially exposed beneath the others. His gaze settled on a familiar name. His own. The young officer blinked. Once. Then again. He stepped closer without realizing it. The heading at the top of the document was unmistakable. A civil rights misconduct proceeding scheduled for the following morning. Beneath it appeared the name of the presiding judge. Nathaniel Brooks. For a moment, nobody moved. The realization struck harder than any argument could have. The man Ethan had dismissed. The man he had doubted. The man he had treated as though his accomplishments were impossible. That man was scheduled to oversee a case directly connected to the kind of conduct now unfolding inside the station itself. Ethan felt the weight of every assumption he had made. Every word. Every decision. Across the lobby, Nathaniel remained composed. His expression revealed neither triumph nor anger. Only quiet understanding. And somehow that made the silence even heavier. The lobby remained silent long after the realization settled over the room. Rain continued sliding down the station windows, tracing slow paths through the reflected glow of the parking lot lights outside. Ethan Walker stood motionless beside the front desk. The document bearing his name still rested on the counter. He no longer looked at it. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Nathaniel Brooks. For the first time that night, he was not looking at a stranger. He was looking at the consequences of his own assumptions. Around them, officers exchanged uneasy glances. The desk sergeant quietly closed several computer screens and stepped away from the counter, sensing that something more important than procedure was unfolding. Michael gathered the court documents and placed them back inside his portfolio. No one seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. The sound felt unusually loud inside the quiet station. "Your Honor," he began. The words came slowly, almost unfamiliar. Nathaniel looked at him without expression. Not cold, not angry, simply attentive. Ethan swallowed. "I made a mistake." The sentence hung in the air. Nathaniel said nothing. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "Several mistakes." Outside, a flash of distant lightning illuminated the rain clouds above the city. For a moment, pale light spilled across the lobby windows before fading again. Ethan took a slow breath. Throughout his career, he had always believed confidence was strength. Tonight, he was discovering that admitting failure required far more courage. "I should have listened," he said quietly. "I should have verified the facts before deciding who you were." Nathaniel studied him carefully. The older judge had heard countless apologies during his years on the bench. Some were sincere. Others were strategic. Some sought forgiveness. Others merely sought relief. This one felt different. Ethan was not trying to escape embarrassment. He was confronting it. "Officer Walker," Nathaniel said calmly, "do you know why courts exist?" Ethan looked surprised by the question. "To enforce the law?" Nathaniel gently shook his head. "No, laws already exist." The room remained silent. Courts exist because human beings are imperfect. They exist because assumptions are dangerous. They exist because facts matter more than pride. Ethan listened without moving. Nathaniel's voice never rose. Yet every word seemed to carry weight. "Tonight was never about my title," Nathaniel continued. "If I had not been a judge, the truth would still matter. If I had been a teacher, a mechanic, a janitor, or a retiree driving home from visiting family, the truth would still matter." Ethan slowly lowered his head. The simplicity of the statement struck harder than any accusation could have. Nathaniel stepped closer. "The law is not personal. Justice is not personal. That is why they survive our mistakes." The young officer looked up. His eyes reflected something entirely absent earlier that night. Understanding. Not complete. Not comfortable. But real. Nathaniel offered a small nod. Not as a judge. Not as an authority figure. Simply as one human being acknowledging another's opportunity to do better. Beyond the windows, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. The rain softened to a gentle whisper against the glass. And inside the station, the tension that had filled every corner of the room slowly gave way to something else. Reflection. The next morning arrived wrapped in clear skies and golden sunlight. The storm had disappeared sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed clean beneath the soft light of a North Carolina morning. Nathaniel Brooks stepped from a black sedan and walked toward the courthouse entrance with the same steady pace he had carried for decades. The marble steps gleamed beneath the rising sun. American flags moved gently in the cool breeze. Around him, attorneys hurried through the plaza carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Court staff exchanged greetings as they entered the building. It looked like any other morning. Yet for one person, everything felt different. Ethan Walker stood across the street near the edge of the courthouse square. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was straight. But the confidence that once came so easily now felt quieter, more measured. He watched Nathaniel climb the steps without drawing attention to himself. The judge never looked in his direction. He simply continued forward. Calm, focused, unchanged. Somehow that made the lesson even stronger. Inside the courthouse, sunlight streamed through tall windows and stretched across polished floors. Nathaniel walked through security, greeted several clerks by name, and continued toward his courtroom. The familiar sounds surrounded him. Footsteps echoing in hallways. Pages turning. Doors opening and closing. The ordinary rhythm of justice beginning another day. As he approached the courtroom entrance, Michael caught up beside him carrying a stack of files. You could have made things very difficult for him, the attorney said quietly. Nathaniel glanced toward the sunlight spilling across the floor. No, he replied. His decisions made things difficult for him. Michael nodded. After a moment, he smiled. You never change. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. I hope not. Minutes later, he entered the courtroom. Conversations immediately quieted. Attorneys stood. Court officers took their positions. Morning light illuminated the bench as Nathaniel took his seat. The room settled into silence. For a brief moment, he looked out across the courtroom. Different faces, different backgrounds, different stories. Yet every person present depended on the same principle. That facts mattered more than assumptions. That truth mattered more than pride. Outside, Ethan remained standing in the courthouse square. He could see the sunlight reflecting from the upper windows. Cars passed along the street. Pedestrians crossed at the corner. Life moved forward as it always did. But something inside him had shifted. For years he had believed authority came from a badge, a title, or a uniform. Now he understood something Nathaniel had known all along. Real authority came from character, from restraint, from choosing fairness even when given every opportunity not to. A cool breeze moved through the trees lining the courthouse lawn. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back toward the building one final time. High above the city, sunlight glowed against the courthouse windows. Inside, Nathaniel Brooks continued his work exactly as he had the day before. Exactly as he would the day after. No speech, no celebration, no revenge. Just the quiet presence of a man who never needed power to prove his worth. And in the silence that followed, justice spoke louder than any words ever could.